Well, good morning. This is Lew Rockwell, and what an honor to have as our guest this morning, Judge John V. Denson. Judge Denson is not only an important lawyer in Alabama and nationally, but a revisionist historian. His book, A Century of War, is a tremendous introduction to the crimes of Lincoln, Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt. His edited book, The Cost of War, and Reassessing the Presidency are also very important works. But one of the things we love about John Denson is he's constantly reading and finding new books. I mean, it's just an astounding, wonderful thing. And today he's come to us with two new books on the origins of World War I that tell a different story from the normal stuff we're told. So, Judge Denson, tell us about these books and their authors and why they're important.
Lew, I've brought you some more hidden history. I came earlier with another book by the name of Hidden History.
Great book, too, yes.
And this is a book, the title is Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War. And the authors are Jerry Docherty and Jim McGregor, and they're from Scotland. And they spent about 10 years doing the research for these two books. This one was published in 2013. And the second book has just come out in the last couple of months. And I have a first edition here in paperback, and it's called Prolonging the Agony, How the Anglo-American Establishment Deliberately Extended World War I by 3.5 years.
3.5 years.
So it brings up a lot of new material. I just looking here back, it says that everything that you've learned about who started World War I is probably wrong. To me, it's almost like a lawsuit where you're the judge and you got lawyers submitting two different briefs. And we're talking about one event, the First World War, and we got one group that says Germany is entirely at fault. And Exhibit A is the Versailles Treaty. Germany was guilty. And these authors say that's not true at all, that the guilty party is the British started it. And they started it for a specific purpose. And the only country standing in the way of them creating a new world order was Germany. So that's the aim of the study, is to show how this group, a secret elite group, started World War I. The inspiration, I guess you would call it, or the reason they got into this were the earlier works of Carroll Quigley. Carroll Quigley wrote two books about World War I, and he went into World War II also. But the first book Carroll Quigley wrote was called The Anglo-American Establishment, and that was from World War I up through 1947. He finished writing it in 1949. And it told about this secret Anglo-American group that was put together for the purpose of creating a new world order. And they couldn't find a publisher for that one.
I wonder why.
So he did 10 years of research and toned it down some and wrote Tragedy and Hope. And this is the first book that I read that indicated there was some secret society that was causing things to happen.
This man was a professor. He taught at Harvard and he taught at Georgetown. He was a very important guy.
Very accomplished historian. He taught at Georgetown. He had a student by the name of Bill Clinton. And when Clinton gave his acceptance speech, the first acceptance speech, he gave credit to Carroll Quigley for being the most important man that affected his thinking. And I think if I'm not mistaken, Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar.
He was a Rhodes Scholar.
So that was part of this group's plan, was to create the Rhodes Scholarships and bring Americans to Oxford. So let me read this is something I've quoted a lot of times, and it came out of the book Tragedy and Hope. And it gives you the indication there is such a group that is influential, that's causing things to happen. Here's what Quigley wrote. There does exist and has existed for generations an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical rights believe the Communist Act. In fact, this network which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years to study their secret documents. So here's a very accomplished historian. I don't know what purpose they had him doing this, but they obviously trusted him to look at their secret documents that nobody else was able to see on the outside. He says, I have no aversion to it or to its aims, and here for much of my life has been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, notably its belief that England was an Atlantic rather than a European power and must be allied or even federated with the United States and must remain isolated from Europe. But in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown. And I believe in its role in history is so significant that it needs to be known. So, here's this really fascinated me. It's never made much sense to me how you get a world war going over the assassination of an archduke in Austria. I mean, assassinations of political leaders and so forth, and what it had to do with England, So anyway, the authors of these two new books, Hidden History and the Prolonging, they go into a lot of Carroll Quigley's book. They rely on that. In each of these two new books, Chapter 1 is on there, how this all originated. So it all starts in 1870 with a Professor John Ruskin at Oxford. And he had two students that were a major part of this secret elite group, Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner. And Alfred Milner ends up being with the whole group all the way up through World War II, and he's sort of the quarterback of the group. But Cecil Rhodes took down notes what John Ruskin said and recruited a group. And both Rhodes and Milner went to South Africa. And the Dutch had settled that area down there as farmers. And the group that Rhodes put together started the Boer War. And it's one of the most brutal wars in history, and the British were criticized a lot for it because these were farmers on this land down there. That land happened to contain the world's best supply of gold and diamonds. So this group took over that, and the country of Rhodesia is named for Cecil Rhodes. And he wrote something like 7 wills, and one of them talked about the secret group. Then they pointed out that if you put that in a will, it's going to be a public document. So he took that out. But he made Milner the trustee for his 7th will, and that's when he created these Rhodes scholarships. And the idea of Ruskin that these people adopted it, and I don't know whether this was just a cover or whether they really believed this, but Ruskin thought that the British Empire was the greatest political organization it had ever been, and it was created by the most intelligent, wealthy people, and that needed to be expanded into reclaiming America as part of the Anglo-American establishment or secret elite. So that's the way they got started, and they put together both of these books, Hidden History and Prolonging the Agony, contain a diagram of who exactly these people are. It shows you the inner circle, a very small inner circle of about 7 people, Lord Rothschild and others that international bankers that have a tendency to loan money for purposes of war. So the thing about going back to tragedy and hope, the tragedy that Quigley talked about was that this group undoubtedly had a terrible effect on the 20th century by causing World War I and World War II. But the hope is that people will recognize that wars and depressions are not natural events like an eruption of a volcano or an earthquake. They're man-made. And the way to end war in the future is to learn from the mistakes. And that was his hope, that this this would help us do that. But Quigley never abandoned his support of the idea of the secret elite, that they wanted a new world order. Let me point out that this book, Hidden History, has 51 pages of footnotes. And the way I read it, I kept a marker there, and almost every sentence almost contains a fact with a footnote. And I go back to the footnotes and read it, and sometimes the footnotes tell you a whole lot more than the text. But the sources they went to are phenomenal, went all over the world. And a lot of our professors, established professors, furnished them information and sources and told them where to look as long as they didn't use their names. These guys may want tenure or something, and so they don't want to be associated with this kind of revisionism. But then the other one, Prolonging the Agony, has about 35 pages of footnotes, but each one has this diagram. So it's useful when you read these books to use that diagram and see who these people are and what section that they controlled. In other words, they had to control the academia, which was Oxford, the writing of the history. They controlled the writing of the history. They had to control the politics. They had Balfour is related. His mother was a member of the Cecil family, which has been the power behind the throne forever. And with the Rothschilds, Lord Rothschild was a member and financed many wars. International banking, the news media, the people that own the major newspapers were part of it. So you control the academia, the history, the politics, and the international finance. And J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller eventually became members of the group. And talking about getting into World War I, they recognized that they were going to have America in the war eventually. So they decided they needed a central bank in America. And this group, as we all know from Jekyll Island, the book about it, they went secretly to Jekyll Island and created this Federal Reserve. And the first bill was opposed by President Taft. He said that they need more government control. This is a bunch of private individuals. So they had to get rid of Taft. So they ran Teddy Roosevelt and sent a fellow named Colonel House over to promote a very obscure politician named Woodrow Wilson, got him elected to New Jersey governorship and then to the presidency. And he was in full agreement with this group and wanted to create the Federal Reserve and get America into the war. So here's their plan of how to proceed. The only way they could create this new world order with the English-speaking hierarchy in control was to get rid of Germany. Germany had progressed to the point economically and in other ways to even surpass the British Empire in some ways, and was a real threat to their idea of English-speaking Anglo-Saxon world government. So they planned this war, and they knew that they had to get Russia and France and their land armies in to squeeze Germany. And there was a lot of behind-the-scenes talking to Russia and France back as early as 1904 about the war.
Wow.
None of this was known to the Parliament. This is all secretly done. So they promised the Russians that, you get into this war and you could get Constantinople and get your warm water port, get into the Mediterranean. When in reality, they never intended for Russia to be successful in that. They were going to let Russia get in the war and help them, but they were going to prevent Russia from achieving that goal. And they talked to France about, you can get Alsace and Lorraine back. And so that was the carrot at the end of the story for these two countries. So they're waiting for a spark that they could fan the flames and get the war going. And there was an incident in Morocco that looked promising, but it turned out to be the Germans didn't take the bait. But when the Archduke of Austria was assassinated, they weren't a part of the plot to assassinate, but they took that spark and fanned the flame by putting their representatives into the inside of the Austrian government and the decisions that were made, as well as in Serbia, to make sure that they did not settle that incident. And the demand that Austria made was, we want to come into Serbia and make our own investigation. And the Serbians were instructed not to agree to that. And the Kaiser had indicated to Austrians that he would support them. And then when he saw how bad it was getting, he tried to talk them out of the conditions. But they went on, and Austria then declares war. So the Edward, who became Edward the Seventh, was of course related to the Tsar. He was considered a ne'er-do-well by Victoria, and she had him on a very strict allowance. And but he was traveling around ostensibly just going on pleasure trips. But Lord Rothschild created an unlimited expense account for him, and he would talk to heads of government. And so the Russians were convinced that they needed to mobilize and go to war. So then the treaty with France then brought France in. So Russia and France mobilized before Germany ever did anything. And then finally Germany had to protect itself. So that's how they got World War I started, was to use that incident of the Archduke as the spark. But they had all these other plans made to get the war going.
John, what about the Lusitania?
Yeah, they had to get America in. So the Lusitania is a major thing. Of course, Winston Churchill was involved there. He made it make sure that he was not in England at the time, but all of this was planned in advance. And the Lusitania was built to have secret compartments to store things in. And it was financed partly by the British government with the understanding that in time of war, they could control the Lusitania. But it was still a passenger ship. And the thing that I learned new out of this book was one of these books is that the true manifest that showed truly what was in the Lusitania was a huge supply of explosives that were being taken to Britain. And that manifest was found in the Presidential Library of Franklin Roosevelt in 2012. The false manifest that was used at the customs just showed a few bullets were stored there, nothing to worry anybody. But these compartments, those secret compartments, were designed just for that purpose. And so, the Secretary of State tried to get Wilson to warn people not to be on the Lusitania. He refused to give the warning because he was the whole plan was to use that to get America in. But America was so much against getting in that didn't do the trick. But it shows you sort of a Pearl Harbor deal where you're trying to provoke something to get America into the war. So that was an important part of it. I was going to read a little bit of section on from Hidden History. This is page 12. It says, what this book sets out to prove is that unscrupulous men whose roots and origins were in Britain sought a war to crush Germany and orchestrated events in order to bring this about. 1914 is generally considered as a starting point for the disaster that followed, but the crucial decision led to war had been taken many years before.
So this was in 1904?
Right.
Yeah.
He says, continuing here, the horror of the British concentration camps in South Africa, where 20,000 children died, was conveniently glossed over. The devastating loss of generation in World War, for which these men were deliberately responsible, has been glorified by the lie that they died for freedom and civilization. This book focuses on how a cabal of international bankers, industrialists, and their political agents successfully used war to destroy the Boer Republic and then Germany, and they were never called to account for it.
No war guilt there.
Right. This is on page 14 of the introduction to Hidden History. It says, the members of this secret elite were only too well aware that Germany was rapidly beginning to overtake Britain in all areas of knowledge and science, industry, and commerce. They also considered Germany to be the cuckoo in the empire's nest, African nest, and were concerned about its growing influence in Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East. They set out to ditch the cuckoo. The secret elite were influenced by the philosophy of the 19th century Oxford professor John Ruskin, whose concept was built on the belief in the superiority and the authority of the English ruling classes acting in the best interest of their inferiors. And they professed that what they intended for the good of mankind and for civilization, a civilization that they would control, approve, manage, and make profitable, for they were prepared to do what was necessary. They would make war for civilization, slaughter millions in the name of civilization. Wrapped in the great banner of civilization, this became a secret society like none other before it. Not only did it have the backing of the privileged and the wealthy, but it was also protected from criticism and hidden beneath a shroud of altruism over the world and for its own good, save the world from itself. So that shows you how the war got going. The second book was published by another publisher. The Random House bought the publisher that did Hidden History, and Random House didn't agree. They wanted to do the second volume.
You have to wonder if they bought the publisher for that reason.
You would think so. So they went to another publisher, and that's why this book didn't come out until this year, Prolonging the Agony of the War. But they've got two quotes here that really show the reason for prolonging the war. In other words, by 1915, it looked like there was just a stalemate. There was no way that either side was going to win. Well, that's the worst thing that could happen for this group because, number one, the international bankers needed to make more money for a long war, and this group needed to smash Germany. They didn't need to leave Germany in power. So the first quotation is from Smedley Butler's great book called War is a Racket. He says that the quote is at the start of the book says, "War is a racket. It always has been. It's possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is only one international in scope. It is only one in which the people are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group know what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of a war, a few people make huge fortunes. In World War I, which he was involved with, he was a major general in the United States Marines. He wrote this immediately after the war. He said, in World War I, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the war. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their late returns, no one knows. So he points out what this book is about, prolonging the war in order to make money. Secondly, the quote is from a soldier, a famous soldier and poet named Siegfried Sassoon. And he wrote this a year before the war ended to his commanding officer. I mean, this is would be called, I guess, treason today. But he says, I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that the war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I am no longer willing to be a party or prolonging this suffrage for that end which I believe to be evil and unjust. I don't know what they did to him, but he was still famous after the war.
He had an important reputation as a poet.
Yeah.
So my guess is that gave him strength that they couldn't just crush him.
Right. So how do they get, they don't want Russia to get the Dardanelles and Constantinople, so they have a plan for that. But the Russians had complained that Britain wasn't doing enough in the war and the Russians were taking the big losses. So the plot was to have a suicide war in Gallipoli to prove to the Russians that the British were really trying. So it was a planned failure, planned by Churchill, that they fought in Gallipoli and they were defeated. And that was to prove to keep the Russians in. The way they got the Russians out is they financed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia with the understanding that the Bolsheviks would take over, that Russia would get out. So the financing for the Bolshevik Revolution came from these people. I've read many times before about Jacob Schiff sending huge sums of money, to the Bolsheviks to get the revolution going. And then I suppose they probably felt that they could turn on and off the money and they could defeat the Bolsheviks when they needed to. But anyway, that's how they got Russia out, but they had to bring America in. So the Lusitania and other things, the submarine warfare excuse, was brought to bring America in, and that had to bring the smashing of Germany. And that's why you get to the Versailles Treaty, and Germany is not a part of any of the negotiations. And after 6 months, they come to the conclusion that the war is completely the fault of Germany. And you and I have talked about this before, and this has been recorded in several books, that John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen went to World War I peace conference with their uncle, Secretary of State Lansing, and they let John Foster compose the War Guilt Clause. I think the number is Part 231 or something of the treaty, holding Germany completely liable. And Germany had no role in getting that done. So they accomplished their purpose of smashing Germany, but almost ruined Western civilization as far as World War I and the effect that it had. And Quigley admits that this group had great intentions. This world government was going to eliminate war. And
just have a lot of wars in the meantime.
and the whole thing shows you that wars can be caused by groups that you're not aware that exist, and that strings are being pulled by people behind the scenes. And wars can be avoided, I think, by honesty and transparency and everything that this group was doing. They had Balfour, they had Lloyd George, Churchill, but they were not informing the whole war, the Parliament, what was going on. And all this was being done by a few select, very powerful people. So these are two really great books. I recommend them, and I recommend you read each sentence. And if you don't, people are necessarily going to say this is conspiracy theory. And these authors realize that and say, this isn't conspiracy theory, this is conspiracy fact. And to prove about the existence of this group further is that David Rockefeller, in his memoirs of 2002, proudly claimed he and his family had been a part of this group from the beginning, and that he fully supported this New World Order. So this is not some mystery group. You've got Quigley, who is right in the middle of it, studying it, seeing their secret dockets. You've got David Rockefeller admitting that it exists. And at an earlier Bilderberger meeting in, I think, 1991, he thanked the Washington Post and New York Times for the fact they never revealed that this group existed. And he said that they'd never been able to accomplish all they had done if it had been exposed by the news media. So there's been no secret as far as Rockefeller. I don't know of anybody else that's talked about the group other than Quigley and Rockefeller, but I think it's a very important thing for history to reflect the truth, and it's my theory that wars can be avoided if we know the truth. It's not hidden from us by a secret, powerful group like this.
John, thanks a million for talking to us about these important books. We'll, of course, link to them in the podcast and to the other books you discussed, the Quigley books. This is just such important information for us to have because they're constantly ginning up new wars. This is not something that ended in 1917 or whatever. So it's a constant thing. They make a gazillion dollars out of it. They live on blood. They're like vampires. So thank you for exposing them.
Let me give you one personal experience before we
Please,
sign
yes.
off. About a month ago, I was having my car repaired in another city, And this young man was about 35 years old, and he was having his new Porsche repaired in some way. And we sat there for about 3 hours. I had to wait till they got it fixed. And so we got into a conversation about he'd owned several Porsches. And I said, what do you do? He said, well, I was in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I said, really? And you bought these Porsches from your pay as a soldier? He said, no, after the Army, I stayed on and worked for contractors. He said, I worked for a private contractor in Afghanistan for about 7 or 8 years. And he said, a person like me as a driver of truck I made over $200,000 a year. And I accumulated quite some wealth, in the Afghanistan war as a private contractor. He said, I never told him what my views were at all. And he said, there's no telling what the owner of the private contractor, Halliburton or somebody else, Blackwater or something, no telling what they make, he said, if a truck driver can make $200,000. So prolonging the agony goes into how much money can be made out of war. And that's why that second book is very important also.
Well, John, thanks a million, and I hope you'll come back many times and keep enlightening us about these important books that we might otherwise not know anything about, and about the issues that they discuss. And Judge John V. Denson, thanks a million.
Thank you. Always good to be with you, Lew.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the LRC front page. Thank you.